So hi, I'm Samantha from USC, and this is Barely Beloved, Halsin's Queerness and Self-Identity in Baldur's Gate 3. So I kind of start with, does everyone remember the Panel from Hell release showcase where we see that they showed the bare sex scene between Halsin and the Astarion? Well, as we know, that kind of starts this discursive conversation of queerness within Baldur's Gate 3 back in 2023. So this is for a book. So this chapter is arguing that BG3 facilitates multi-layered queerness via Halsin's wild-shape mechanic and its rejection of narrative, class, and sex-designated boundaries by interacting with Halsin's metamorphic abilities, so the wild shape, which we'll get into. Players can connect with this queerness and further queer the game and characters themselves outside the boundaries of the game. So first, Halsin's shapeshifting mechanic, if you're unfamiliar with Baldur's Gate, it is, well, based on D&D, 5e in particular. So narratively, Halsin is an archdruid. He can transform, he can transform into different animals and shapes and is connected to nature. So in the game, he's narratively a druid with this ability, but players can reclass Halsin into different classes. However, he will always still retain his wild shape cave bear form. So as per the bottom picture, you can multi-class him into barbarian, you can switch him out of it. And this kind of relates to Bo Roberg's notion of, and they wrote, video games have always been queer in 2019. So notions that queer resistance can exist within rejecting the mechanical norms and binaries within video games themselves. So by being able to shift Halsin into different classes and rejecting his narrative status as a shapeshifting druid is one form of queering the game, while the other form is that because he can always retain one shapeshifting ability, which is his beloved brown cave bear that you saw in the image with the Astarion, it is also its own queering as well, since he's always somehow still a little bit of a druid, despite if I turned him into a bard. And in-game, and in another layer of this mechanical queering, in-game, all the wild shape models lack sexual dimorphism, and sexual dimorphism is the difference in appearance within the same species, which allows them to be sexed. So male ducks having different colors than the female ducks, and that's how we sex them. So this ambiguity of the wild shape sex seemingly refutes the narrative assumptions that Halsin's cave bear form should be male. It also is a resistance against his nature as this tall, hunky male elf, since there is no sexual dimorphism. It's also a refuting against biosensualist world building, to which I pull from an essay regarding how the Asari and Mass Effect are, people constantly say are female, yet narratively in their own lore are non-binary and do not really fit into those models. So in that same way of biocentrist world building and gaming, that in-game character shape models of the wild shape forms reject that worldview. As we can see from this image of Yes Might Have, Jaheira on the left is a female half-elf, Halsin on the right, male wood elf. Those are two indistinguishable forms. There's nothing different between them. So in the romance scene itself, though, the titular romance scene, so all romance options in Baldur's Gate 3 are, quote, player sexual. This is not a term I really saw them use, but I saw the press kind of use, meaning that all characters' romantic and sexual orientation are firmly and solely fixed onto the player. Steve Holmes, in the analysis of the romance of Dragon Age Origins, to which I know someone's covering Dragon Age later, and other Bioware titles, instead uses the term conditional bisexuality to explain this in the phenomenon of player-centered romance. So what he means is that narratively, or the characters themselves are just only bisexual when you kind of choose them to be, despite maybe some narrative implications. So in one sense, we could see maybe Halsin does sort of fit into this because of the player's sexual notions. However, his actual narrative status that we get through bits of dialogue and interactions, whether you decide to romance or not, that he's pansexual and polyamorous. So he doesn't fully fit into that conditional bisexuality terminology that Holmes uses, and not even really, you could say, into the player sexual as well. So I pulled the quote of "I welcome all nature's blessings, whether they come to me at one at a time or in multitudes. There's no shame in it." So there is again this kind of dual queering of that notion of what the player's sexual is, because his narrative status is already being queer. On top of that, in the notion of like Holmes's definition of conditional bisexuality, that it doesn't matter what sex or gender you chose your character to be, that these scenes don't change because it's just a convenience for the creators to not change this in terms of creating the game. So Halsin's sex scene does not change regardless of player sex and gender. He will always transform into a bear when he gets hot in that moment. Although this intense desire for the player, as seen within this uncontrollable metamorphosis, if you know the scene, you've seen it, is not bound by heteronormative or social standards. It is queer, transcending the boundaries between man, beast, society, and nature, binary conceptualizations of gender, and embracing the unstable form of Halsin's metamorphosizing body. Because in the scene, he comes in, his blood runs hot, he transforms for 10 seconds, and you can reject it or continue. So should you continue and want to have sex in the bear form, you're embracing him as he is and just between that boundary of man and nature. If you're not, you do have dialogue in which you kind of suggest it will happen later. So that's a little queer in itself. And the last section is just player reaction to the queerness in the bear. As we know, some of it was kind of negative to many people. There was a joke about it, especially about that scene. We see this in speedrunning as well. This is another notion from Bo Ruberg, where they argue that speedrunning is queering of time, so considering queer time because players are attempting to defy the normal completion of times in games. So then there was a speedrun of percent sex to the bear. But that can also be seen as still kind of making a joke of the scene. However, other player reactions was tapping more into that queerness and that metamorphic ideal. So fan art of Halsin as a bear, which I found from furry websites, is a persona or just mixed with a bear. So furries are, of course, individuals who are especially interested in anthropomorphic or cartoon animals and identify with those animals through personas. There's also Halsin as part of the gay subculture bear label. So bears are queer men that exude specific masculinities, including broad bodies and lots of hair. And in these images, there was Halsin literally as a bear with a bear form in a bearsona, if you will, a bear persona. And then the other one for gay bear subcultures, there was discussions of whether we should give Halsin a more like rotund sort of fitting that bear label body. So there was actual positive reactions as well, and an extension of that queering of the character by further queering within these queer spaces, or again, queering of time in general. So kind of altogether, House's transformative body shows queer potential in gameplay and representational aspects of Baldur's Gate 3 and video games more broadly. The fluidity of Halsin's wild shape and player interpretations of it embed metamorphism in a state of always queering, views on sex, the indistinguishable sexual dimorphism, in the design of the character's well-shaped models provide an inability for Halsin to be bound in bioessentialist binary views of sex and gender. So again, this was from a forthcoming book, Transformative Scenes of Metamorphosis and Popular Culture, edited by Sophia State, and this